October 1963, Calhoun County, Alabama. The smell reached Walter Grimes before the damage did. That particular rot of split wood and wet clay, the kind that settles into the back of the throat and stays there. He was 61 years old. He had walked this same ridge at dawn for 34 years, first behind his father, and then alone, and he knew every sound this land made when it was right, and every silence it kept when it was not. He came over the hill at first light on a Tuesday morning, the air still cold enough to ache in his knuckles, and he stopped walking. The orchard was gone. Not all of it. Not in the tidy, total way that a fire takes things. A tornado had tracked northeast through the lower 40 acres on Sunday night, while Walter sat in his kitchen listening to the radio, and it had moved through his peach orchard the way a hand moves through wheat, randomly, selectively, without logic. 47 trees stood split at the trunk. 19 more had been lifted clean from the ground, root balls and all, and set back down 6 feet from where they had grown, the exposed soil still dark and raw beneath them. The irrigation lines he had trenched himself in the summer of 1951, running 212 feet down the slope to the creek pumping station, lay coiled above the surface like something shed and abandoned. 3 sections of the 6-foot cedar fence along the county road had collapsed outward onto Route 12, and the posts, treated pine, set 3 feet deep, had simply snapped at grade. Walter Grimes stood at the top of the ridge with his hands in the pockets of his canvas work coat and looked at the lower 40 for a long time without speaking. There was no one to speak to. His wife, Ruth, had died in March of 1959. His son, Dennis, had gone to work at the paper mill in Bruton 2 years after that. The farm was Walter's alone, and the debt attached to it was his alone, and the reckoning coming toward him from the First National Bank of Anniston was his alone. He owed $14,200 on a crop loan that had financed the orchard's 1962 expansion. 19 new Georgia Bell peach trees planted in the lower field at $210 per tree installed, plus the irrigation extension and new rootstock treatment. The loan carried a note due in full by April 1964, secured against the farm. The farm was 118 acres. It had been in the Grimes family since 1921, purchased by Walter's father, Horace, for $1,840 cash after 2 years of cotton labor. Walter knew this because the receipt was still in the tin box under the kitchen floorboard, written in his father's hand. The annual peach harvest from the lower 40 had been generating roughly $800–900 in gross revenue. With the trees destroyed, that number was 0. The upper orchard, 31 trees on the drier slope above the barn, had survived the storm mostly intact, but that ground produced smaller fruit and had never carried more than $3,100 in a season. It was not enough to service the loan and keep the farm operating through spring. Walter turned and walked back up the hill toward the barn. He needed to call the county extension agent. If you are watching this and have not yet subscribed, please do. It helps this channel keep telling stories like this one. The Calhoun County Cooperative Extension Office occupied a 2-room cinder block building on Pelham Road in Anniston, and its agricultural agent was a man named Gerald Fitch, 34 years old, who had completed his master's degree in agricultural science at Auburn University in 1958. Fitch drove out to the Grimes farm on the Wednesday after the storm in a green 1962 Ford F-100 pickup, wearing a khaki shirt with the Alabama Cooperative Extension Service emblem ironed onto the left breast. He walked the lower 40 with Walter, for about 20 minutes, taking notes on a yellow legal pad and occasionally crouching to examine root damage or soil exposure. Back at the fence line, Fitch tore the top sheet from his pad and handed it to Walter. "You've got 4 viable root systems in the lower quadrant," Fitch said. "The rest is total loss for this season. Realistically, you're looking at 2 to 3 years before replanted stock produces commercial volume. My recommendation is to apply for emergency crop assistance through the USDA office in Anniston and consider fallowing the lower field for at least 1 full growing season while the soil stabilizes." Walter looked at the sheet. It listed 4 tree numbers in Fitch's handwriting, a suggested variety for replanting, Alberta, the standard recommendation, and a phone number for the USDA county office. "What about the loan note?" Walter said. "That's a bank matter," Fitch said. "Extension doesn't have authority there. I'd suggest speaking to First National about a deferral." He said it the way a man says something he knows won't work, but needs to say anyway. First National Bank of Anniston did not offer deferral. Walter drove to the main branch on Noble Street on a Thursday in late October and sat across a walnut desk from a loan officer named Thomas Hadley, who reviewed the farm file with both hands flat on the desk and explained that the note was secured by the land and that the bank's policy on crop loss deferrals required documentation from the USDA certifying a declared agricultural emergency, which Calhoun County had not received and was not expected to receive because the damage had been local and not regional in scope. Hadley's exact words, as Walter would later recall them to his neighbor, Calvin Pruitt, were these: "Mr. Grimes, a 40-acre peach operation does not constitute an agricultural emergency. You've got another 40 acres of producing orchard. Work with what you have." Walter had 31 trees on 41 acres of thin slope soil, not 40 acres of producing orchard. The distinction mattered by roughly $5,800 per year. He did not correct Hadley. He folded his copy of the loan document, put it in the inside pocket of his work coat, and drove home. What Walter Grimes knew, and what Gerald Fitch, Thomas Hadley, and every neighbor along Route 12 did not know, was that the lower 40 acres of the Grimes farm were not simply flat orchard ground. They were, beneath the 4 inches of sandy topsoil, a band of blue marl clay that ran northwest to southeast across the property and had been documented in a single handwritten survey note made by his father, Horace, in the spring of 1928. The note was in the tin box. It read, "Lower field, blue clay, 4 to 6 inches under. Holds water 10 to 14 days after rain. Bad for stone fruit, good for something else." Horace Grimes had never pursued the something else. He planted cotton on the upper ground and left the lower field fallow for years, then sold a timber cutting right on it in 1934 and planted a kitchen garden the following spring that failed because of standing water. When Walter took over the farm in 1947, he had amended the lower soil with gypsum and sand over 3 years and forced peaches into it on the logic that drainage tiles would compensate for the clay. The tiles had worked, but only partially. The trees in the lower 40 always ran 2 to 3 weeks, behind the upper orchard in blossom set, and consistently produced fruit with higher moisture content, which meant they bruised faster in transport and commanded lower prices from the Anniston packing house. Walter had known since 1954 that the lower 40 was the wrong ground for peaches. He had planted them there anyway because peaches were what Calhoun County grew, and because Fitch's predecessor at the Extension Office had told him Georgia bells would adapt to the soil. They had adapted imperfectly, and now the storm had removed them entirely. Standing at the kitchen table, the night after his meeting with Hadley, Walter unfolded his father's 1928 survey note and read it again. Then he opened the bottom drawer of the kitchen cabinet and took out a second document, a 1931 issue of the Alabama Agricultural Experiment Station Bulletin, number 234, titled Preliminary Observations on Native Fruit Culture in the Coastal Plain Region. He had found it in a box of his father's papers in 1948 and had read it twice without acting on it. He read it again now. Section 4 of the bulletin described, in 3 paragraphs of dry academic prose, the cultivation behavior of the Asimina triloba, the common pawpaw, in clay-heavy bottomland soils across central Alabama. The bulletin's author, a researcher named Dr. Edmund Boyce, noted that pawpaw root systems actively preferred high-moisture clay retention, that the fruit required no spray program because its bark and leaves contained natural alkaloids repellent to most pest species, and that a well-established pawpaw grove on appropriate soil could produce commercially viable fruit in years 4 through 6 after planting and continue bearing for 30 to 40 years with minimal input. The specific yield estimate, based on Boyce's trial plots near Selma, was 40 to 50 pounds of fruit per mature tree per season. At the bottom of page 11 in pencil, in his father's handwriting, someone had written, "Lower Field, try this." Horace Grimes had read this bulletin in 1931 and done nothing. Walter had read it in 1948 and done nothing. The note had sat under a kitchen floorboard for 15 years, while peach trees struggled in clay soil 20 yards from where they should never have been planted. Walter put the bulletin on the kitchen table, set his coffee cup on the corner to keep it flat, and sat down in his chair. He did not call anyone. He did not tell Fitch or Pruitt or Dennis down in Bruton. He picked up a pencil and began calculating on the back of an envelope. The lower 40, cleared of tornado debris, could accommodate approximately 340 pawpaw trees, spaced 22 feet apart in staggered rows, the spacing Boyce recommended for maximum cross-pollination. At Boyce's conservative estimate of 40 pounds per mature tree beginning in year 5, a full grove at capacity would yield roughly 13,600 pounds of fruit per season. Pawpaw fruit in 1963 had no established commercial price in Alabama because no one was growing it commercially. Walter wrote a question mark next to the yield figure and turned the envelope over. He called his son Dennis on Friday evening and told him the storm had taken the lower orchard and that he intended to plant something else in it. "What kind of something else?" Dennis said. "Pawpaws," Walter said. There was a pause on the line. "Dad, nobody buys pawpaws." "Some people do," Walter said. "Good night, Dennis." He hung up and went to bed. In November of 1963, Walter Grimes hired Calvin Pruitt's 2 older sons, Roy and James, to help him clear the storm debris from the lower 40. They worked with a chainsaw, a Ford 8N tractor in red, and a borrowed flatbed trailer, cutting the split peach trunks to cordwood length and dragging the uprooted trees by chain to the north fence line where they would dry for burning. The work took 11 days. Roy Pruitt was 22 years old and said very little. James was 19 and asked Walter twice what he intended to plant in the cleared ground. Walter told him he was still deciding. He was not still deciding. He had already written to 3 nurseries, one in Tennessee, one in Georgia, and one in Mississippi, requesting pricing on bare root pawpaw seedlings, 2-year stock, mixed varieties for cross-pollination. Only the Mississippi nursery, located outside Hattiesburg, responded. They offered 2-year sunflower variety seedlings at $0.85 each, minimum order 100, available for spring shipping in late March. Walter ordered 280 seedlings for $238, which he paid from the farm's operating reserve, the last $400 he had in liquid savings. That winter, Walter spent 3 weeks amending the lower field soil. He did not add sand or gypsum, as he had done for the peaches. Boyce's bulletin specified that pawpaw preferred its native clay environment, and that amendment actually reduced root establishment in the first 2 years. Instead, Walter worked a single application of aged manure into the top 2 inches of soil, enough to feed surface biology without disturbing the clay structure beneath. He used the 8N with a disc harrow running at half depth, 3 inches, careful not to breach the clay layer his father had documented 35 years before. Calvin Pruitt watched him from the fence line one afternoon in December, his breath visible in the cold air, his hands resting on the top rail. "You're not going very deep," Pruitt said. "No," Walter said, and kept driving. In February of 1964, Walter drove to Anniston and filed the farm's financial hardship statement with First National Bank, requesting a 6-month extension on the crop loan note. Hadley reviewed the request and denied it in writing within 2 weeks. The letter cited the bank's policy on secured agricultural loans and noted that the upper orchard was still producing and that no declared emergency status had been issued for Calhoun County. It was a form letter with Hadley's signature at the bottom. Walter took the letter to Raymond Oates, an attorney in Anniston, who handled farm disputes for $15 an hour, and asked him what options existed. Oates reviewed the loan documents for 40 minutes, then told Walter that the bank's denial was technically within its rights, but that the original loan agreement contained a clause, standard language from the Alabama Bankers Association template, 1961 edition, requiring the bank to provide written notice of any collateral assessment if the secured property underwent a significant change in productive capacity. The storm damage to the lower 40 constituted exactly such a change, and the bank had conducted no reassessment and issued no notice. "It won't get the note canceled," Oates said, "but it gives you standing to delay proceedings through the summer if they try to call the note in full." Walter told him to file the formal objection. Oates charged him $45. Walter paid it. The 280 pawpaw seedlings arrived from Hattiesburg in late March of 1964, packed in damp burlap in 2 wooden crates, each seedling a bare root with a stick of top growth about 14 inches tall. Walter planted them over 4 days, working alone from first light to dark, setting each one 22 feet from its neighbor in staggered diagonal rows, pressing the root collar to exactly 1 inch below grade, as Boyce's bulletin specified, firming the soil with both hands around each stem, and then again with the heel of his boot. His hands were dark with clay by the end of each day. He ate his lunch sitting on an overturned crate at the field's edge, looking at the rows of small sticks in the turned ground. From the road, it looked like nothing. Roy Pruitt drove past on a Thursday and stopped his truck at the gate. "What did you put in?" Roy called. "Fruit trees," Walter said. Roy looked at the rows of sticks for a moment. "Those don't look like much." "They're not much yet," Walter said, and went back to work. At the Anniston Farmers Supply on Court Street, where Walter bought his equipment parts, and where the men of Calhoun County's agricultural community gathered most Saturday mornings to drink coffee from wax paper cups and discuss the week, Gerald Fitch mentioned one morning in April of 1964 that he'd heard Walter Grimes had planted something unusual in the storm-damaged field. "Pawpaws," said Leonard Haynes, who farmed corn and soybeans 4 miles south of Walter. "My wife's mother used to have one in the yard. It's a yard tree. You can't run a farm on yard trees." Fitch nodded slowly. He didn't say anything negative. He was a careful man. But he did say, "There's no established market infrastructure for pawpaw in this county. Even if the yield is adequate, distribution would be speculative." The men at the counter agreed this was probably right. Walter was not at the feed store that morning. He was in the lower field, checking soil moisture at the base of the seedlings with his finger, pressing 2 inches into the clay, feeling for the retained damp that the marl layer held for days after rain. The clay was doing exactly what his father's note said it would do. Every seedling he checked had firm, moist soil at root level, even though it had not rained in 9 days. He noted this in a small brown pocket ledger he kept in his work coat. The date, the row number, the soil condition, the air temperature. He had been keeping this ledger since 1947. The handwriting in the early pages was younger, more certain. By 1964 it was smaller and more deliberate, the pen pressed harder into the paper. In the spring of 1964, First National Bank did not call the loan note in full. Raymond Oates's procedural objection had created enough legal friction that Hadley chose to extend the note another 6 months, rather than engage in a formal dispute process. It was not mercy. It was the calculation of a man who did not want the paperwork. But it gave Walter until October. By June of 1964, all but 11 of the 280 seedlings had broken dormancy and pushed new growth, pale green shoots extending 4 to 6 inches above the original stick top. Walter counted them on a Sunday evening, walking each row with the ledger, and wrote the number 269 in the margin beside the planting date. He did not celebrate. He made a note of the 11 failed plants, pulled them from the ground, and ordered 11 replacements from the Hattiesburg nursery at his own cost. That was the only early sign. He noted it and kept working. The summer of 1964 brought a complication Walter had not anticipated. One of his upper orchard peach trees, a veteran Georgia bell planted in 1949 that had produced reliably for 15 years, developed a late-season canker disease, a bacterial infection that entered through a pruning wound and spread through the cambium layer. By August, it had jumped to 3 adjacent trees. Walter cut all 4 trees down in the second week of August, burned the wood, and treated the surrounding soil with a lime application. The upper orchard was now 27 trees on 41 acres. His revenue projection for the 1964 peach season dropped from $3,100 to an estimated $2,400. The loan note remained due in October. Walter had $2,400 in projected revenue, a pending legal objection that bought time, but not money, and 269 pawpaw seedlings 18 months from commercial production at the absolute earliest, and more likely 4 years. He drove to Bruton and sat in Dennis's kitchen on a Saturday evening in August and laid out the numbers on the table. Dennis was 33 years old and looked at the envelope with the calculations and did not speak for a long time. "How much do you need?" Dennis said finally. 8,000, Walter said. to cover the note and carry operating costs through next spring. Dennis looked at his wife, Carol, who was standing at the sink with her back to the table. She did not turn around. There was a long quiet in the kitchen. "I've got $4,200 saved," Dennis said. "That's everything." Walter looked at his son. "I'm not asking for it." "I know you're not," Dennis said. "I'm offering it." Walter looked at the envelope for a moment. Then he said, "I'll need the rest from somewhere." He found the rest from the Federal Land Bank of Louisville's Alabama branch, which offered a production loan on the pawpaw planting at 5.5% annual interest, lower than the First National note, based on a soil assessment that confirmed the clay retention characteristics of the lower 40, and a reference letter from Raymond Oates documenting the planting records, and Boyce's Bulletin as the agronomic basis. The Federal Land Bank loan officer in Birmingham, a woman named Mrs. Cecilia Marsh, had reviewed the bulletin before Walter's appointment. She told him she had never seen a pawpaw production loan application before. "Is there a market for them?" she said. "There will be," Walter said. She approved $4,200. Walter combined it with Dennis's $4,200, paid off the First National note in full in October of 1964, and walked out of Thomas Hadley's office without sitting down. He needed to say one thing to Hadley, and he said it standing in front of the desk. "Your 1961 loan agreement had a clause requiring written reassessment notice. You didn't send one." Hadley looked at him. "Mr. Grimes, the note is paid. There's nothing further to discuss." "No," Walter agreed and left. Raymond Oates filed the formal complaint regarding the bank's procedural violation with the Alabama State Banking Department in November of 1964. The complaint documented Hadley's failure to issue the required collateral reassessment notice after a material change in the secured property's productive capacity, and cited the specific clause number from the 1961 Alabama Bankers Association template. The banking department reviewed the complaint over the following 4 months, and in March of 1965 issued a formal written finding that First National Bank of Anniston had violated procedural requirements under Alabama Code Section 5-19-4. The bank was required to revise its loan servicing procedures for all secured agricultural loans and to provide written notification to the banking department of the revised policy within 90 days. Thomas Hadley did not lose his job, but the finding was entered into the bank's regulatory file and was referenced in the bank's next examination audit. First National revised its agricultural loan servicing policy in June of 1965. The revision was drafted by a junior officer, not Hadley. Hadley was reassigned from agricultural lending to commercial accounts in the fall of that year. His name no longer appeared on farm loan correspondence. The pawpaw grove grew. Walter tended it with a simplicity that violated every conventional orchard management protocol Gerald Fitch would have recognized. No spray program. No fertilizer applications after the first-year manure amendment. No thinning of fruit clusters beyond what the tree accomplished naturally. He mowed between the rows twice per season, with the 8N fitted with a belly mower, keeping the ground cover short enough to prevent moisture competition at the root zone, but long enough to hold soil during rain. He walked the rows once per week with the ledger, noting leaf color, new growth rate, canopy spread, and any signs of pest pressure. There were almost none. The alkaloid compounds in pawpaw bark and foliage that Boyce's Bulletin had described, specifically the acetogenin compounds that the plant produced in its tissues, rendered it unpalatable to nearly every insect species that plagued conventional orchard crops. Walter watched his neighbors spend money on spray equipment every season, while his trees stood unmolested. He noted this in the ledger without comment. By the spring of 1966, the pawpaw trees had grown to an average height of 6 feet, with canopies spreading 4 to 5 feet in diameter. They were past the stage where they looked like ornamental plantings and had begun to look like something organized and intentional, the rows visible from Route 12 as a dark, full-leafed stand, distinct from the pale canopy of the upper peach orchard above it. Leonard Haynes stopped his truck at the gate in April of 1966 and looked at the grove for a long moment. "Those are getting big," he said to Walter, who was walking the fence line. "Yes," Walter said. "When do they bear?" "Next year, probably. Year after at full volume." Haynes nodded and drove on. He said nothing more, but he turned his truck around at the next crossroad and drove back past the field a second time, looking at the rows again before he continued south. In 1967, the pawpaw grove produced its first commercial fruit. It was not full production, 94. Of the 269 trees bore fruit that season, with an average yield of 23 pounds per bearing tree. Total harvest, approximately 2,162 pounds. Walter boxed the fruit himself in wax-lined cardboard flats, 12 pounds per flat, and drove to 4 destinations in a single day in October: a grocery in Anniston, a produce market in Gadsden, a restaurant supply distributor in Birmingham, and a fruit stand on the highway outside Talladega. He had visited each of these buyers in the previous June, brought samples, and discussed pricing. The grocery offered $0.35 per pound. The Gadsden market offered $0.30. The Birmingham distributor offered $0.28 per pound on volume. The highway fruit stand offered $0.40 per pound cash, no contract. Walter sold 800 pounds to the fruit stand, 700 pounds to the Anniston grocery, 400 pounds to Gadsden, and 262 pounds to Birmingham. Total revenue, $758. It was not enough to constitute a recovery, but it was real money from a field that had been a write-off 2 years before. Walter entered the number in the ledger and noted the buyer distribution, the price per destination, and the observation that every buyer had requested more volume for the following season. He called Dennis that evening. "First harvest came in," he said, $758. Dennis was quiet for a moment. "Is that good?" "It's a start," Walter said. "The trees that bore this year will double their yield by 1969. The rest will begin bearing next season." "And the market?" "I'll have more market than I have fruit," Walter said. "That's the right problem to have." Dennis said, "I'll be damned." Walter said goodnight and hung up. By the fall of 1968, all 269 trees were bearing. The season yield was 9,400 pounds. Walter had expanded his buyer network to 11 destinations across 4 counties, and he had negotiated a standing weekly delivery contract with a grocery cooperative in Birmingham that purchased 200 pounds per week from late September through October at $0.38 per pound. Total 1968 revenue from the Pawpaw Grove, $3,572. Combined with the Upper Peach Orchard's $2,800 season, the Grimes farm cleared $6,372 in gross revenue, more than it had earned in any single season since 1960. The following year, 1969, the grove reached something close to full production. The seasonal yield was 12,800 pounds. By this time, Walter had a reputation in the county that he had not sought and could not entirely prevent. Buyers spoke to other buyers. The Birmingham Grocery Cooperative mentioned his name to a produce writer at the Birmingham News, who drove out to Calhoun County in September and asked Walter for a quote. Walter gave him 3 sentences: what he had planted, when he had planted it, and what it had yielded. He declined to discuss his methods in detail. He declined to be photographed in front of the grove. The writer published a brief item on page 14 of the paper's weekly agricultural section, mentioning the Grimes farm and noting the unusual commercial success of a native fruit species in northern Alabama. Gerald Fitch read the item on a Thursday morning. He drove out to Route 12 that same afternoon and stood at the gate of the lower field for 20 minutes. The grove was in its October bearing season, the trees heavy with fruit, the ground under the canopy dark with fallen pawpaws. The smell was something between banana and vanilla, sweet and faintly fermented, reaching the fence line on the light wind. Fitch had smelled pawpaw fruit before. Every Alabamian of his generation had. But he had never stood inside a commercial-scale planting of it, had never seen 40 acres of the tree in organized, managed production. He found Walter on the upper slope and walked up to him. "I didn't think this would work," Fitch said. Walter was examining a peach limb for canker, running his thumb along the bark at the crotch of a major scaffold branch, feeling for the softness that indicated cambial infection. "I know," Walter said. Fitch looked at the lower grove for a moment. "I should have looked at the soil report before I recommended Alberta stock for that ground." Walter kept examining the limb. "You were going off standard practice." "Standard practice was wrong for this site," Fitch said. Walter let go of the limb and looked at him. "Yes, it was." Fitch wrote a note on the Pawpaw Project for the Alabama Cooperative Extension Service internal newsletter in November of 1969. It was 3 pages long and described the Grimes Farm's soil characteristics, planting methodology, yield progression, and market development over 6 years. It cited Boyce's 1931 bulletin directly and recommended that extension agents in clay-heavy soil counties of Alabama assess native fruit species compatibility as a standard component of crop loss recovery consultations. The note was circulated to 42 county extension offices. 2 of them, one in Dallas County and one in Monroe County, initiated pawpaw trial plantings on recommended client farms within 18 months of reading it. Both plantings succeeded. Please like this video if you've made it this far. It genuinely helps this channel grow. The knowledge did not travel fast. It moved the way useful knowledge moves in agricultural communities, from agent to agent, farm to farm, season to season, with the slow conviction of things proven by evidence rather than announced by authority. By 1973, there were 7 commercial or semi-commercial pawpaw plantings in Alabama farms south of the fall line. None of the farmers who planted them had heard of Walter Grimes. 3 of them had read Fitch's 1969 extension note. 2 had heard about the native fruit trial from their county agent. 2 had read Boyce's original 1931 bulletin, which had been reprinted by the Alabama Agricultural Experiment Station in 1971, after Fitch's note created renewed interest in it. Walter continued farming. He did not attend the meetings at which his methods were discussed. He did not correspond with the other farmers. He did not apply for the USDA Conservation Award that Fitch nominated him for in 1972, because he sent the nomination form back unopened with a note on the envelope that said, "Not necessary, thank you." Calvin Pruitt told people about this for years. He found it, in his words, both completely ridiculous and exactly right. By 1974, the Grimes Farm's annual gross revenue from the Pawpaw Grove had stabilized at approximately $9,800 per season, with peach revenue from the upper orchard adding another $2,900. The federal land bank loan had been paid off in 1971. The farm carried no debt. Walter was 72 years old and worked the same hours he had worked at 45, beginning at first light, ending when the light failed. Dennis drove up from Bruton on a Saturday in the fall of 1975 and walked the lower grove with his father for the first time since the trees had matured. He was 44 years old, broad across the shoulders, with his father's way of moving. Deliberate, economical, his eyes reading the ground ahead of his feet. They walked the rows without speaking much. Dennis stopped at a tree in the 7th row, one of the original 1964 seedlings, now 11 years old, with a trunk diameter of 4 inches at breast height and a canopy spread of nearly 14 feet. It was still bearing. The fruit hung in clusters at the branch tips, green-yellow, each one the size of a short banana, heavy enough to droop the small branches. "How long do they live?" Dennis said. 40 years if you let them," Walter said. "Maybe longer. Boyce didn't have data past 30. Dennis reached up and pressed one of the fruits gently with his thumb, testing its give. "Don't pick it," Walter said. 3 more days." Dennis smiled and put his hand down. They walked to the end of the row. "What happens when you can't walk them anymore?" Dennis said. Walter looked at the row behind them, the trees receding in the October light, the ground under them soft with fallen leaves and the faint, sweet smell of ripe fruit. "That's why you're here," Walter said. Dennis came back the following spring. He came back the spring after that. By 1978, he had given notice at the paper mill and moved back to the farm with Carol and their daughter Meredith, who was 14 years old and already helping with the harvest. Walter taught Dennis the soil assessment technique his father had passed to him, pressing 3 fingers into the clay at root depth, reading moisture by resistance, learning the difference between clay that was holding water usefully and clay that was saturated to the point of anaerobic damage. He taught him the Rouse spacing logic from Boyce's bulletin and the reasons for each choice. He showed him the 1931 bulletin itself, now in a manila envelope, in the tin box, and the penciled note in Horace's handwriting on page 11. Dennis read the page and looked at it for a long time. "Grandpa knew," he said. "He wrote it down," Walter said. That was enough. Walter kept the pocket ledger until 1981. The last entry was dated October 14th of that year, a Tuesday, and read, "Row 12, trees 8 through 14, full bearing. Soil good, light frost expected Friday, harvest by Thursday." The handwriting was smaller than it had been in 1964. The pen was pressed very hard into the paper. He died in February of 1982, at the age of 79, in the farmhouse his father had bought in 1921. The tin box was under the kitchen floorboard. The ledger was in the top drawer of the kitchen cabinet. The 1931 bulletin was in the manila envelope inside the tin box, with the pencil note still legible on page 11. The 8N tractor, red, 1952 Ford, serial number 8N43002, was in the barn. It had been maintained on a posted service schedule tacked to the barn wall in Walter's handwriting. Oil change every 100 hours. Magneto timing check every spring. Hydraulic fluid level monthly. The last service entry in the log was dated September 3rd, 1981. Every line of the log had been filled in, every date met. Dennis kept the service log. He kept the maintenance schedule on the barn wall. He kept the tractor running. Meredith Grimes was 24 years old when her grandfather died, and she had been walking the paw-paw rows with her father since she was 14. She understood the soil assessment technique. She understood the row spacing. She understood why the trees were planted in the lower field and not the upper slope. When Dennis explained it to her one afternoon in 1985, standing at the base of one of the original 1964 trees, now 21 years old, still bearing, the trunk thick as a fence post, he used the same language his father had used. "The clay holds the water," he said. "The water feeds the root. The root doesn't need anything else." Meredith pressed her fingers into the soil at the tree's base. She felt the held moisture 2 inches down, the resistance of the marl layer below it, the specific weight of well-managed clay soil. "Why don't people just plant peaches down here?" she said. "The soil's been amended enough by now." Dennis looked at the tree above them. "Because this works," he said. "That's a sufficient reason." She thought about this for a moment. "Grandpa never talked about it much from what you've said." "No." "Did he know it would work when he planted them?" Dennis picked up a pawpaw fruit from the ground, still firm, not yet ripe. He turned it in his hands. "He knew the clay was right for it," he said. "He knew the bulletin was sound. He knew the peaches had been wrong for that ground for 20 years. He set the fruit back down precisely where he had found it. That was enough to act on." Meredith nodded slowly. She stood up and brushed the clay from her fingers against her jeans, the same gesture, the same unhurried pressure that her grandfather had made walking these same rows in 1964, when the trees were sticks in turned ground and the loan was due in October, and nobody in Calhoun County believed it would amount to anything. If this story meant something to you, a like and a subscribe keeps this channel going. Thank you. The lower field of the Grimes Farm in Calhoun County, Alabama, still produces pawpaw fruit. The original trees planted in 1964 are gone now, succeeded by the second and third generation of root sprouts that pawpaw trees produce naturally, the grove renewing itself, as the species does, from the ground that held it. The 1931 Alabama Agricultural Experiment Station Bulletin, number 234, is in the tin box. The pocket ledger is in the kitchen drawer. The 8N is in the barn. Horace Grimes wrote "Lower Field, try this" in pencil on page 11 in 1931. His son read it in 1948 and waited. His son's son walked the ground in 1982 and understood. His son's daughter pressed her fingers into the clay in 1985 and felt what 4 generations of the same knowledge felt like from the inside. The clay held the water. The water fed the root. The work continued. That is what it looks like when knowledge survives the people who first found it, not as a monument, not as a lesson, but as a practice. As a hand pressed into the ground in early morning, reading the soil the way it taught itself to be read, as a number written in a ledger, as a tractor serviced on schedule in a barn in Alabama, running still, waiting for whoever comes next. If you have been watching to the end, thank you. That means something.